Greetings, I'm Yvonne Stapp for Science for the Public, and I welcome you to Contemporary Science Issues and Innovations. Today we go exploring with an archaeologist who's an expert on the Vikings, or Norsemen. Douglas Bolender is a research assistant professor at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and Dr. Bolender appeared in a Nova BBC documentary called Vikings Unearthed, and he kindly agreed to describe for us how archaeologists locate first and then examine ancient, widespread Norsemen Viking settlements. Dr. Bolender, thank you very much for joining us.
Happy to be here.
First question, is there a difference between Norsemen and Vikings? How should we use that?
Yeah, so this is a thing that comes up over and over again, and we have in our contemporary world a very popular notion of Vikings. I teach a class on Vikings, and every semester when I teach this, the first thing I ask students to do when they come into the classroom is draw a picture of a Viking, and they can always draw essentially exactly the same picture. It is always a man with a beard and a helmet with horns, yes, and an axe and a shield and sometimes a boat. And we all know exactly what a Viking is. And there were people in this world who did this, who were Vikings, which is a kind of profession. It's an activity.
Okay.
The equivalent of sort of a pirate or a trader, that you go out and engage in the activity of Viking. But that's only what somebody might do some of the time. And when we talk about the world and the culture that these people lived in, we usually use the term Norse, which refers to the whole linguistic and cultural association of people who lived in Scandinavia around 1,000 years ago, a little bit more, and then moved out during the Viking Age to settle in places like England and Scotland and into the Baltic and eventually into the North Atlantic, colonizing islands like Iceland, Greenland, and even North America.
Right. Now, so those that went out, were they still Vikings as opposed, I mean, they happened to be Norsemen when they were home, and but those who did not go out, were they called Vikings too?
Yeah, we do have this term that is used rarely in the literature from that time, which is Viking, and that people were described as Viking and they engaged in Viking. But many of those people, when they went out, they went and traded or raided,
right.
But they also went and settled in new places, and at that point, they're just Norse farmers who may be living in Scotland or living in Iceland or even trying to live in North America.
Right. Now, that they had to have lots of names.
Yeah.
Identity cards, okay. Now, I found you through a documentary, and you were one of the archaeologists featured in the Nova and BBC documentary Vikings Unearthed, and that showed rather nicely how people like you locate these widespread settlements and so on. And I wonder if you tell us something about that, how you search for, how do you find these things? Because these people are all over the place.
So we have different techniques that we use in different parts of the Viking world. And that has a lot to do with both the kind of settlements that we have in different parts of that world and also the contemporary landscape. So any archaeologist who's going out to look for ancient sites has to contend with what's on the ground today. So you may have a city, you may have Oslo, for example, that is sitting on top of whatever Viking Age material was there. And so in some place like Scandinavia, often Viking Age sites are under contemporary towns, and they may be largely invisible. You'll often find them by accident when somebody's building a new sewer line. In other places like Iceland, which is still largely rural, and there are many farms that are out in the sort of contemporary Icelandic landscape, there we actually know that most of those farms that people are living in today were actually established 1,000 or 1,100 years ago when the Norse first came to Iceland. And they set up those farms. So one of the easiest ways to find a Viking Age farm in Iceland is to go to a contemporary farm and
start
dig a hole. And most of the time you'll find one there. In other places, this has different complications. So in Greenland, the Norse who went there disappeared in the 15th century. The colony died out. And there we see medieval ruins. Often there's a Viking Age component to those, and you can see those on the contemporary landscape. And the most difficult place to do this, the place that we have run into the most consistent problems with finding sites, is in North America. So
And that's the one everybody wants.
that's what everybody wants. And so we know that they came to North America. They tell us this. In 1960, Helgi Instinct and Ann Stein discovered the so far only fully validated Norse site in North America, which is at Lonesome Meadows in Newfoundland. That was excavated and demonstrated that there were Norse people there around the same time that our historical sources say that they were there, around 1000 AD or so. We also know that they traveled much more broadly, and that we know from historical sources. They tell us that they explored. We also know this from archaeological material. So there's a very famous butternut that was found at Lonesome Meadows from a tree. And this is a tree that never grew in that part of Newfoundland. It goes about as far as the interior areas of Quebec or New Brunswick. And so somebody brought this there, hundreds of miles of distance. And so we know the Norse are traveling all around this area.
Traveling, though, is not the same as settling.
Yes.
And now you're the expert on the Iceland settlements, and so they made it to North America. Was this they settled there? Is that a settled question, where as opposed to Iceland?
So this is a completely open question right now. So Iceland, we have a very good idea of the settlement. We understand sort of when people came. We even have a fair degree of control over sort of what happened in subsequent generations over the next 100 years or so. In North America, we have, again, this one site, Lonesome Meadows. It's unusual. So most Norse sites are farms, and they have all of the things you would expect from a farm, especially animals and barns. Lonesome Meadows so far has very little evidence that supports the idea that there were domestic animals there. We don't have barns at the site. We don't have a lot of really any faunal material from livestock there. So it doesn't look like a farm. Which it looks more like, well, we don't really know what it looks like, but it looks like something that looks a lot like a farm, but perhaps is a place where they're exploring, venturing, doing expeditions, getting raw materials. And so even at Lonesome Meadows, we're not sure that this is a settled place. And we don't know what else they're doing anywhere else, in part because we just haven't identified anywhere else. The sagas, these old stories we get from the medieval world, they do tell us that there was at least one effort to create a farm in North America, somewhere in this place called Vinland. And so far that hasn't been found, and that has been one of the things that people have been looking for. Any other evidence beyond Lonesome Meadows of the Norse to help us better understand what they were doing here and how long they were here.
Now, back to Iceland, because they went Greenland, they went Iceland, and this, we'll talk about the traveling bit in a minute. But in Iceland, they settled successfully. And you said today even, that's the best farm land. Could you tell us?
Yes.
Their effect,
So one of the things that we've tried to do to better understand this initial colonization of Iceland, get a sense of the timing, and also how was this landscape shaped as people came from overseas, claimed land, established farms, and then slowly divided that out and built more farms. Today there's well over 4,000 farms in Iceland.
That is amazing, isn't it?
And our sources tell us that there were about 400 settling expeditions that settled farms in the late 9th century and early 10th century. And so we have this big gap from a few people coming to a world that's completely full. So many archaeologists have worked on this over the years, exploring different regions. My own work with partners in Iceland and at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. We've worked in the north of Iceland for the last 20 years, focusing on regions where we go in and we look at an area with, say, 15 or 20 farms today, and we carefully go to every single farm, and we go and we look to see if there's a Viking Age layer there, and we try to date that layer, and we also try to look at the size of that farm, mostly by looking at just how much material do we see, how much does it spread out from the Viking Age. Basically, old building materials, old material from hearths, ash and charcoal. And we measure the size of that and we date that for every single farm. And we very carefully go and make sure that we didn't miss anything. So we'll check across essentially the entire contemporary landscape to see if there's something hidden. Is there a farm that somebody made 1,000 years ago and abandoned or moved that we need to know about? And we do find those sometimes where somebody built a farm and then it is no longer used after a generation or two. And sometimes they move from one place to another. And by looking at that very carefully, we can map basically where the first farm in any area was, when the next farm came in, and how that landscape filled up. And what we find is it took them about 100 to 150 years to create all of the farms that we see today. And we see one other thing that's very interesting in this pattern, which is that the earliest farms, the farms that we know were the first ones that they made, they're consistently larger in the Viking Age than other farms. So it seems like if you get there early, you get to make a pretty big farm. And then as time goes on, each new farm is squeezed into another spot and it's a little bit smaller. And the other amazing thing about this is that what we see is that this order, this dynamic of how you come into this land over 1,000 years ago is actually incredibly predictive of how valuable and how productive a farm is, even in the 19th century and to some degree today. So when we do this, we look at an archaeology and we say, we have a size of a farm from 1,000 years ago, and the amazing thing is that will predict reasonably well the number of cows that farm had in 1900 versus another farm. So this settlement is incredibly important because it shaped the society for the rest of basically history.
Now, were they the only ones around? Were they the only population in Iceland? So they went in and they could have the whole place.
Yeah, Iceland is one of those places that we think is almost entirely unsettled before the Norse get there. There are some questions. So we have historical sources that tell us, both from Ireland and the Norse themselves, that say that when the Norse first came, there were Irish priests who were there. There's no reason not to believe this. We have different historical sources. This would have been a very small population, presumably going for retreats, monastic retreats, not actually setting up farms or living there permanently. There's been efforts to archaeologically identify them. We've never seen any real traces of them. And so whatever this was, it was very, very small. Iceland is also one of those places where we have no evidence of an indigenous population before the Norse came there.
Which would make a difference.
It seems to be essentially an almost 100%
barren.
Well, natural environment, unhuman environment.
Right, I see. Now, when they got there, they did really well. Greenland was not quite so good, apparently, and other places perhaps. But then why did they move out of the Scandinavian region? What was the motivation?
So there's been a lot of research on this, and we're not entirely certain about the constellation of pressures that moved people out to places like Iceland or Greenland or even Scotland. And we do see that these are large migrations. I mean, there are...
They are large.
Yeah, I mean, there's thousands of people going within a generation to some place like Iceland, and that's a lot of people to leave at one time. So we think there's a bunch of things that happened. So one of them is that we actually think that commercial enterprises were important. So in places like Iceland and Greenland, there were walrus. And walrus ivory was highly marketable in medieval Europe. A very, very valuable commodity. And we see that some of the earliest farms are definitely using walrus. And in fact, the exploitation is so heavy in some place like Iceland that the local walrus population was made extinct within 100 or 200 years. They wiped out the local walrus. So that could have been a motivation for people going. Also, we tell stories, or we hear stories that are written down that suggest that one of the pressures was political. That in Norway, in the 9th century, there were emergent kings that were beginning to consolidate different regions and enforce their own dominion over groups of people that had previously been fairly independent or had their local leaders. And so you were often in a position where you either had to join with the king, or it might have been politically expedient to leave. And so you get a combination where people have been maybe going to some place like Iceland for exploiting it for walrus and other things,
and then think,
and then suddenly there's a reason that you have a motivation to leave, and you can set up a new farm. And maybe the best place to set up a new farm in this moment is in Iceland, where if you're the first person in, you can claim, dozens of square miles and set up a very wealthy farm.
And live happily ever after.
Well, and as I said, your children are set up, and even your children's or 100 years later are benefiting from that.
Right. Now, getting there, one of the reasons for asking that was pretty tricky. This is a really rough ocean, I thought, the North Atlantic, and getting these distances, and so their navigation expertise must have been pretty good, but they are famous for their ships as well. Could you tell us something about those ships? And I'll try to insert an image, but one of the things was, how did you ever carry all that stuff on these ships? So the ships.
So the Norse are obviously very famous for their ships, and it's an amazing piece of technology. They're beautiful. Their construction is simply amazing. They're not unique. We certainly have other ships in Europe that are somewhat similar, but the Norse certainly seem to have this moment during the Viking Age where they are refining shipbuilding in ways that are very significant. And there's a couple features of those, which is one, that the ships are often very shallow and very flexible. And so they are capable of both going in open ocean, but also potentially being pulled up on a beach or sailing up a river. And and this is where we get the stories about the Vikings. The sort of the raider part is very real, that they could show up from nowhere on your shore, raid a town, raid a monastery, and disappear that day. We know that they could sail up like the Thames or the Seine into France and stop by your village, even if you're well away from the coast. And this happened. And they terrorized Europe for 100 years. They also have these ships that, again, the technology is somewhat amazing because they're flexible. So they're built around a keel, and there's no hard structure like we have in a modern boat with a solid hull. And if you've ever been out on a boat, you know that if you have waves, it sort of hits them and bounces into them. So these boats, based on this long keel, which makes the main structure of these long ships, there are pieces that are pulled together, sewn or nailed, but the overall structure has this ability to continue to flex and bend. I've never had the chance to take one of these out on the open ocean, but I work with a bunch of people who do, and they say that they're really like no other ships they've ever been on, because they'll actually flex and swell over the ocean. And so you have a boat that is an advance in technology, that is highly mobile and can go almost anywhere. And these are the boats that they began to load people into to both raid and then colonize in new places, in the British Isles, in the Eastern Baltic, and then also move out into the North Atlantic and settle places like Iceland.
I imagine they must have done that, like the river explorations before they hit the North Atlantic, these high waves and things, and they were ready for everything. But that flat bottom and the structure of the boats would have just been fantastic. They traded extensively, didn't they, into what would be modern Russia, all over the place. There are two things I want to ask you about that. The extent of that trade, because they seem to be a little unique that way. They're really out there, far extended. And the other is they traded slaves, carried slaves. I think mainly from Ireland. Is that correct?
Well, from many places.
Oh,
so
anybody they could get.
Almost anybody they could get. We hear about this, but certainly from Ireland. And we have that both in the historical sources, and we can see that archaeologically, that there are people from the northern British Isles who look like they're out of place. So these trade networks are incredibly extensive, and it's this characteristic of the Viking age in this Viking world, and it extends in the east through the Baltic into the areas today, which are modern Finland, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, Russia, Ukraine, all the way down to the Black Sea.
Isn't that something? Where
they are connecting with the Islamic world,
right.
with the Byzantine Empire and Constantinople, and from there they're articulating with the Silk Road all the way into China, and we see amazing things. We see Chinese silks show up in places like Norway and Iceland, and we have one of the amazing things that we see is hundreds of thousands of silver Islamic dirhams, coins that have been recovered from hoards in Scandinavia, and this is the stuff that got hidden, lost, forgotten. And it's hundreds of thousands of coins. And so that gives you some sense of the scale of this trade. On the other end, they're going all the way into continental Europe, down into the Mediterranean, into the British Isles, and eventually extracting things like walrus from the Disco Bay in Greenland and trading that all the way back. So this is a trade network.
It's really
that spans
phenomenal, isn't
just
it?
an absolutely huge part of the world. And the other thing that we know, again, from some of the sources, is that there are individuals who move throughout almost this entire network. We hear about people who are in Norway, who have family relations with the Rus, the early Norse Slavic kingdom in what is today Russia, who travel down and serve in the imperial guard for the Byzantine emperor, fight wars in Greece, end up dying in contemporary England.
Isn't that something? They just couldn't stay home, could they?
No, and we see the same thing. There are memorial stones in Sweden, these famous, what are called the Greek rune stones, that are memorializing people who died or never returned from the Middle East. And clearly you hear word. Your family goes out, somebody's doing this for however long, they intended to come home, and eventually you get word from somebody else that somebody died and isn't coming back, and they'll set up stones to memorialize them.
That is really amazing. I don't have the impression that other groups in Europe were traveling that extensively at that time. Is that they seem to be ahead of the game that way, and maybe because of their ships?
There's certainly one of the groups that has this very
worldwide,
far-flung trade network.
Exactly.
Of course, trade networks are extensive throughout Europe at that time, but this one is very, very large, and definitely is controlling a traffic for a large amount of goods and articulating with lots and lots of different cultures throughout those areas. They're settling in some of them, sometimes becoming politically connected, but often, they must have been trading with people who are throughout this world and connecting a network that builds on all of these other societies and peoples.
Yeah, so they settle in some areas, and they don't settle everywhere they go, but they settle down in some areas. I just have to ask, how do they carry anything in those ships? Now, especially in the North Atlantic route, I can't imagine getting horses across over to Iceland and so on if they did, but can you please tell us about the inside of those ships?
Yeah, and so this is one of those things. It's the unglamorous part of the reality of these Viking world is that these ships are, as remarkable as they are, They're open vessels, so they have a deck in them, but there's no upper constructions, there's no lower
cabin.
deck, there's no cabin. We think that they would have been tented, so that you would have had some potential for shelter.
Oh, good.
But you're still, if you really imagine this, you're going to be bailing out all the time.
Yes.
That's going to be a continuous part of this. If it rains, if you have rough weather, you're going to spend a lot
Get
of time.
hit by waves.
You're going to spend a lot of time wet. And then for these settlement ventures, they brought everything that they needed with them to set up a new farm. They're bringing stores of grain that would come over to plant and set up their first fields. And they're bringing over all of the livestock that they need too. So if you imagine one of these ships crowded with a family and an extended family, because you're not moving to Iceland with just mom and dad and a kid. You need a bunch of people to set up a farm and clear land.
Right.
And so on one of these ships, you would have all these people, or maybe multiple ships that would go out together in a venture, and you would have cows on it. And you need at least a couple of all of these things, and maybe more to be safe. And you need horses, and you need pigs, and you need sheep that would have been crowded onto these vessels as well. That I don't honestly know how you're keeping them in these open vessels.
That's just it.
But
how
they
did
clearly
not
are.
Fall over?
So they're probably, I would guess that they're tethered on some level in this, and very carefully cared for, and probably very carefully managed. And you're probably taking your prize stock that you have, that are very controlled.
And those are long voyages.
They're long voyages. You're talking about more than a week to 2 weeks on the open ocean. And so that's another piece of the unglamorous. You can imagine you're not just bailing out water that's in these boats, but you're having to bail out the
everything.
Yes.
Everything in a polite word.
In a polite world, to show up at these places.
That is amazing.
They're amazing ventures, and they're doing this without a modern compass.
Yes.
On very rough seas, and we're not sure about their navigation techniques, but we do get sources from the medieval world that give us descriptions that of how do you get from Norway to someplace like Greenland? And the descriptions are very brief. I mean, they essentially go to this place in Norway, sail west. You should basically see the Shetlands about this much. You should maybe see the Faroes about that much. Or you shouldn't see Iceland at all, but you should get close enough that you see birds. And this gives us a hint about some of the ways that they did this, is that they would have been incredibly sophisticated at reading the oceans, of understanding what
currents
fish were in different parts, how deep the water was. And so sometimes we have an imagination of, how do you find an island that's 800 miles away? And you imagine them just blindly sailing. But these people would have had a lot of awareness of how far are you away from land? When are you potentially getting close to land based on birds that might fly 100 or 150 miles away? And so they're, every time you go out, people have a hint. If you go a little further, is there something over there? Does it get more shallow?
Right.
And they would have used these as clues to help them understand exactly where they were, besides using stars and other features.
If it wasn't foggy or something like that. But it is amazing that people had the courage to undertake these kinds of voyages and not know what's going to wait on the other side, and to be able to read that ocean adequately to get somewhere.
And they're very blasé about it. So,
Yeah,
I mean,
how
part of
about
it is
that?
storytelling. You don't
Yeah,
necessarily
right,
tell the
right.
part of we were stuck in the ship for 2 weeks, and that doesn't make
Got
for
a
good
cow in your
storytelling.
lap.
But they treat these as if they are regular
It's
ventures,
amazing.
even though the standard trip would have been for a year, because you would sail one direction in one season and then not turn around. You would have to overwinter and then return. If you left your home, it would be expected that you might not come home for 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, I imagine. And you have to base everything on what you've brought. You don't have crops yet, and so on. They're amazing people. They really were extraordinary, and they survived well in these settlements, correct?
As far as we can tell, they seem to do fairly well. I have to say, one of the motivations for my own research project in Iceland was an assumption. We assumed that the first wave of Norse settlers would get it all wrong. like that they would set up farms, they wouldn't be in the right place,
That
or
happened.
just you lose your livestock, and that places would fail,
Disease,
fairly regularly. And so we went in with an expectation that, we're going to go and we're going to look carefully and we're going to bring new techniques. We use a lot of what is called geophysical surveying, which is basically machines that you move across the ground that can give you some idea of what's buried underneath. And we thought we would see stuff all over the place. And what ended up happening is we actually were very, very wrong. That for the most part, they knew the land, even though it was a new land. They set up a farm, and that farm was successful. We don't see very many farms that failed. The flip side of that is that there is a part of the Norse world, and especially in Iceland, that we know that they didn't get things right. So we see a number of farms that are inland and relatively remote, and those were often abandoned during the Viking Age. And the main reason is that we think that they basically stripped down a lot of the environment. It's a very fragile ecosystem. You put a whole bunch of sheep and cows on it and pigs.
And cut down the trees.
Trees go away, the soil blows away. And so we know Iceland actually lost about 40% of its soil cover in the Viking Age. And those areas, they still haven't recovered today.
Wow.
So there's one side where they got it very right, and there's some areas where we can really see how they got it wrong.
Right. I wish we could go on some more. This is most interesting. A lot of this I've not heard before, and I think it is wonderful to be doing this kind of work. We have to stop, I'm sorry to say, but I thank you so much for giving us this great information.
Thank you.
Best of luck.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, we just hold it for a second here, and he'll tell us.